Okay, Year 11, just to remind you, we're looking at a sequence of lessons about how the Nazis controlled Germany after 1934. Last lesson we looked at the police state, how the Nazis used terror to control the German people. They had the SS, the Gestapo, the concentration camps. Today we're going to look at a more subtle way of control. We're going to look at control through propaganda, censorship and indoctrination. So what I need you to do is obviously just pause video lesson here and just put today's title, which is Propaganda, Censorship and Indoctrination. And then on to the next slide. Okay, we're going to start with some clear definitions. So what's the difference between censorship, propaganda and indoctrination? So to define them, censorship, that's making sure that the public only receives the information you want them to. In order to do this, the government might, for example, ban certain books, magazines or plays, remove sections from films, permit only certain stories in newspapers. So only the good news stories about Nazi Germany would be published. Propaganda, that's manufacturing material with the aim of getting the people on your side. In order to do this, a government might, for example, put out special programs on the radio, make films to influence people's views, publish newspapers that reflect their views. And then finally, indoctrination. This is the aim of propaganda. That's ensuring the public are so smothered by the government's messages that they believe them entirely. In order to do this, a government, for example, might even doctor the examples. That means change the example in textbooks for children so that they give out a political message. So just a quick starter, you just need to produce 3 small mind maps explaining the terms. So a mind map for censorship, one for propaganda, one for indoctrination. You need to pause the video now. Okay, just information only now. Why was propaganda and censorship so important to the Nazis after 1933? Well, it could be used to create a cult of personality that built up Hitler as Germany's one and only leader and saviour. It could be used to get support for Nazi policies, especially ones that might be unpopular, and it could be used to undermine the opposition by showing them as being anti-German. And it could be used to create an atmosphere of pride and obedience that would allow the Nazis ultimately to take Germany to destruction in 1945 and World War II. So propaganda and censorship are central to the Nazis because they see it as a means of furthering their control of Germany. Okay, on to the next slide. Okay, we're now going to explore the main methods of propaganda and censorship used by the Nazis. But first of all, the centre of propaganda and censorship. That was the Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda, a government department. It's created. It was called the Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda. It was run by Joseph Goebbels, who had a PhD in German literature. Goebbels was very clever and a talented speaker in his own right. So the Nazis set up a government department devoted entirely to putting out propaganda about Nazi achievements and to censor anything in Germany that was published that was in any way critical of Hitler or the Nazis. And they had an entire government department headed by Joseph Goebbels to do that. So let's have a look at some of the things that this department did. On to the next slide. So newspapers in Germany. Publishers were taken over, the journalists were controlled, and a press agency headed by Goebbels told the newspapers what to include. Anti-Nazi newspapers were all closed down, newspaper sellers were checked, display boxes were put up for front pages, so even if you didn't buy the Nazi paper, you still could walk around town and see the headlines, which were always positive about what Hitler had achieved, about what the Nazis had achieved. So the Nazis completely took over the newspaper industry in Germany, and any journalist working in Germany only said good things about the Nazis. Nothing negative was published after 1933. On to the next slide. So, the radio. The Reich Radio Company controlled all local radio stations. A cheap radio called the People's Receiver was manufactured so that everyone could receive government broadcasts. Loudspeakers were put up in public places so that everyone could hear Nazi broadcasts in towns and in villages and in cities. And the local blacklighters encouraged everyone to get a radio. And in fact, such was your fear of the Gestapo and the SS, where every time there was a speech by Hitler, every time an important Nazi message came across, you made sure you turned your radio up so everybody could hear you listening to the Nazis. so they couldn't accuse you of being anti-Nazi. So again, this is more propaganda and more censorship. In Germany after 1933, the broadcast media, the radio, it was all pro-Nazi. There was no criticism allowed. Okay, on to the next bit. Okay, the German film industry, lots of new films were made, many with a political message, and you had to stay for the whole programme so that you also saw Nazi newsreels and short documentaries containing Nazi messages. So even a Friday night out propaganda. And the high standards in Weimar films meant the Nazis had to encourage pretty good techniques too. The best of these can be seen in Leni Riefenstahl's two films about Germany under the Nazis, Triumph of the Will and Olympia. And indeed, any film produced in Nazi Germany, be it a drama or whatever, had to have Nazi ideals at the centre of it. So even films meant for entertainment were actually propaganda in disguise. So just on to the next one. So festivals and celebrations, new ones were created to build national identity. These included famously the annual Nuremberg rallies, where Hitler would meet his faithful supporters in their tens of thousands, Hitler's birthday, the anniversary of the Munich Putsch. Most of these people were expected to attend parades and speeches and hang out flags. And the 1936 Berlin Olympics gave the Nazis an extra opportunity to send out their propaganda to the world as well as to the Germans. So just on to the next slide. Okay, culture was subject to a lot of censorship from the Nazis. Music was censored. It had to be German, folk songs, marches, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart and Wagner, and never jazz, which was black and inferior, so no modern music. Theatre had to concentrate on German history and political drama. It could not be critical of the regime. Literature, books had to reflect Nazi ideas too, and many books were banned and infamously burned. These included anything written by Jewish or socialist authors and anything critical of war. Architecture, German buildings had to be classical and monumental to reflect the idea of a German empire as good as the Romans, and art had to be traditional and safe, nothing too modern. This was actually exhibited in a degenerate art exhibition which drew thousands of visitors in Berlin. Okay, we've got some work to do. So you need to use one of the slides or the information in your Word document or your booklet to explain why the Nazis used censorship and propaganda, why it was important to them, and then quite simply describe 3 areas where the Nazis used their techniques of propaganda and censorship. So you could pick newspapers and explain how they were used. You could pick radio and film, explain in detail how they were used. You could pick culture, explain how that was transformed to reflect Nazi ideals, or you could do festivals and celebrations. You just need to pick any 3 out of those 4. And that would conclude your work on how the Nazis used propaganda and censorship to cement their control over the people of Germany. Well done.